And I'm the president of the NFL. I would first of all like to thank our speakers for agreeing to participate and for their enthusiastic support of everything VFL does. I'd also like to thank our advisor, Dr. Catherine Geddick, for moderating this symposium, and Dr. Nancy Kelly at the Center for Liberal Education for making this event ACS approved. For the past few years, faculty have been telling our members that they want to be involved, to tell them whenever they need anything. And so we took them up on that offer, and this year we wanted to involve them in our outreach. And we also wanted to show students that you can be pro-life in various disciplines. You can be pro-life and do other things like a mathematician, a historian, an actor. We might have some of those here today. So this symposium is a combination of those desires. Now I'd just like to briefly introduce everyone and see if I can do it in order. And then they can begin their remarks. First, we have Dr. John Cesky.
Hi.
He teaches in the Villanova Center for Liberal Education. He's been there for 11 years, and he teaches ACS with them. Next is Dr. Bob Steyr, who is a professor in the Department of Mathematical Sciences, and he was in one of the very first pro-life marches in Philadelphia in 1973. So he goes to back. Professor Joanna Shoals is in the Theology Department, Theology and Religious Studies, excuse me, I even wrote it down that way. She has been at Villanova since 1999. Father David Cregan is a professor of theater and English. He's been at Villanova as a professor for 7 years, but I just found out he also graduated from Villanova. So we're very glad he's still there. Dr. David Schindler is a professor of philosophy in the Humanities Department. His family and his wives have been involved in pro-life work for generations, so he also has a good history here. Dr. Amal Richie teaches in the history department. He has always been very supportive of Villanovans For Life. We thank him for that. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Joseph Betts teaches in the Department of Philosophy. And I say not least because he was a former advisor of Villanovans For Life. So everything we are today is certainly owed in part to his contributions. So now I will turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Catherine Geddick.
Well, I have very little to say, just to welcome you again. And I don't want to take time away. I know time is a precious thing. So we've asked all of our panel members to keep their comments limited so we can hear about 5 minutes, but there'll be some mercy. It's a good thing. And then we'll turn it over to have questions, and that's really an important time to have the exchange. So we'll begin. I think we'll begin with Dr. Cesky on the far end, and then we'll just pass the mic down.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine. Do I speak
you can
into
hold
this?
it, you put it on your collar
Oh, okay.
if you want. and
Sure.
just pass that.
Okay. I'm Dr. John Cesky. Thank you so much for having this symposium. It's great to be here with you to talk about such an important issue. And you know, I really respect and am a part of the work that you do as defenders of life. As a professor in the humanities, you can't but help confront what it is to be human. And the humanities, they challenge us to think and reflect more deeply on a fundamental fact of our humanity, and that's our mortality. And in the Augustinian culture course that I teach, I explore classic works in the Western tradition where a central topic is often the topic of suicide. So say in the play Antigone or in Plato's Phaedo, or even when I do the modern section of the course, like in Frankenstein, for example. You have this, the characters encounter their own mortality, and they have to confront in a very direct way the value of human existence. And depending upon the type of work, like say Antigone, which is a tragedy, they often end in death, unfortunately. It provides a context and an occasion to investigate the meaning of life in a more fundamental and a more deep way. The other thing that I think the humanities call forth that's directly related to the life issue, is that to study the humanities is to be inherently future-oriented. You know, it's to think, to reflect today on what it means to be human so that you can lay out a plan how to live your life. And many of the life issues, they really have a future-oriented dimension to them as we seek to protect the unborn or raise questions about what our obligations are to the next generation. Or in confronting the issue of suicide, why is life worth going forward with? And so that's a very future-oriented question that comes out of the humanities that forces us to, reflect on life and the value of human life. And so with those comments, I'll turn it over to Dr. Steyr.
Okay, I'm Bob Steyr, and I teach mathematics. And the most famous mathematics textbook of all time is Euclid's Elements. Euclid's Elements begins with 5 fundamental axioms and a list of precise definitions. From those 5 axioms, we derive all other mathematical truth. So what I want to talk today are give you 5 axioms from which my pro-life convictions follow. So axiom 1, God created us, and we are not the masters of our lives. So my friends and relatives who support abortion are correct when they say I have no right to tell a woman what to do with her body. I have no right over her body, but neither does she. You cannot do with your body what you please. Axiom 2, God created us, and his goal is not to maximize our personal pleasures and to minimize our potential sufferings. Dr. C. Everett Koop, former Surgeon General of the United States and a tireless pro-life advocate, pointed out a few decades ago that if I am the sole master of my life, I have a right to assisted suicide. He also said if our goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering, then euthanasia of disabled children who cannot live a physically and emotionally fulfilling life is mandatory. So axiom 3, God creates the genetic plan of development at conception. So 8 years ago, I was given a sabbatical to study bioinformatics, the study of the genomic code. I enjoyed the mathematics behind it, but frankly, I was overwhelmed by the genetics and the biology I had to learn. For instance, in plant genetics, we studied in detail how the genes and the epigenetic histone bindings turn on and off throughout the earliest development of the protoseed. And the genome of that gamete controls its development relatively independently of the mother plant. And the cascade of developmental genes turning on and off, higher, lower, continue up through the full maturity of the plant. Now, my friends who support abortion ask, is a fetus fully human? And I ask, is a toddler fully human? Genetically, they're still developing. There's a huge number of cascade of changes that are going to take place before they get to adulthood. Physical development is based on profound differences in gene expression, but not a change in the genome itself. Conception defines a genetically distinct and a well-defined individual. Axiom 4, God declares that children are a blessing and not a curse. We all love children, but it does seem that some children are cursed. I have several friends with severely, no, I'm serious. I have several friends with severely handicapped children. And the parents suffer emotional, physical, and financial pain. I've seen many marriages stretched to the breaking point by the demands of disabled children. Now, a little story. Dr. Martin Kleiber just retired from the mathematics department. Many of you might know him because he's blind and he has a white cane, and you might have seen him around campus. And Dr. Kleiber has spent countless hours protesting at abortion clinics, because he's acutely aware that historically the status of handicapped children is not one of support but one of abandonment. And Dr. Kleiber has personally, without compensation, directed independent studies for students with documented math dyscalculia. It's like dyslexia for reading, dyscalculia for math. And whether the handicap is physical or academic, Dr. Kleiber refuses to say that a disability is not worth overcoming, and he works hard to support those with needs. And the answer to the problem of parents and children in pain is to work hard to support their needs. Axiom 5, God is love, and he commands us to love. My mother worked at a state hospital for the mentally handicapped, and one of her favorite patients was a microcephalic. A microcephalic just has this little head, and there's no brain in there. Now, to me, he looked like the definition of a vegetable. I never saw anything except all these tubes and wires and everything on him. And he had no responses, but my mother claims that he would move his eyes slightly when she would talk to him. Now, the other nurses didn't believe that. But when he was 12 years old, a nurse was careless, and he died. And my mother grieved his loss, the loss of a vegetable with no quality of life by any reasonable standard, except by the standard of love. And in reality, my pro-life position is consistent with axiomatic reasoning, but it's not really based on formal logical thought. My mother's unconditional love for this vegetable is the real reason I'm pro-life.
So glad I wore a jacket.
Hi, I'm Joanna Shoals. Can you hear me? I am totally not as well prepared as Dr. Steyr was. And I thank you for coming, Joan. To me, pro-life involves so many things, and maybe that's why I'm not as well prepared as maybe I should have been. I have considered myself the black sheep of pro-life for many years because of my political struggles. I have been told that how can I call myself a Catholic and vote for a Democrat? I feel like I've been through things because of pro-life convictions and pro-life confusions and conscience issues. It's all very difficult. I have always been anti-capital punishment, and I've always found it hard when people who are pro-life are pro-capital punishment. Of course, now I've gotten to a point in my life when I've seen innocents murdered or killed in car accidents, and I want to take those people and put them in front of a firing squad. And that makes it difficult to be pro-life across the board. But that is our challenge. Our challenge is to be pro-life from womb to tomb and to love those who, God is love, to love those who are least lovable, to love those who are least lovable. I have argued to tears with a friend of mine who is an attorney because his goal in pro-life movement has been legislation, and my goals in pro-life have come from the perspective of education, but that's only logical now in thinking back, because he's a lawyer and he thinks of legislation, and I'm a teacher and I think of education. But in the end, we're all on the same team, and I think that's what pro-life people have to realize. We're all on the same team. We all have to work together and stop judging each other for our levels of pro-life. I come to you with just 2 suggestions about organizations. I was just with some of you on Sunday at Johnny's Run for Life. A friend of ours, Johnny Williamson, was killed in a car accident, and this Run for Life benefits A Baby's Breath, which is a place in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, that offers a 24-hour helpline, free pregnancy tests, counseling, prenatal planning, adoption services, in an effort to put our lives and our thoughts into action to help people actually keep their babies. And another place that I would just like to mention to you is in Darby, Pennsylvania, called the Mother's Home, which is a residential shelter for vulnerable women, a safe home to provide places for women in crisis, to provide physical as well as emotional counseling. And developmental needs, so I'm reading now, you can tell that, to give life skills and help women keep their babies and become independent with their children. And I thank you for being here again. And I'm so glad I wore a jacket because I had someplace to pin the microphone.
It's very dangerous to give an actor a microphone. 2 years ago, about almost 3 years ago, I agreed to take on a project for the theater department through the Villanova Student Theater called the Dead Man Walking Theater Project, which is a theater project that's oriented towards raising the awareness about the death penalty based on the screenplay written by Tim Robbins of the life of Sister Helen Progine. And we did that 2 years ago, I think. Where Susanna is, she might know. I think it was 2 years ago, in St. Mary's, in the chapel in St. Mary's Hall. And on closing night of the play, somebody came to me at intermission and said that Tim Robbins was there. And I didn't believe him, but he was. And after that, I got involved with the Dead Man Walking Theater project on the national level through the invitation of Sister Helen Progine. And we were standing in Manhattan, in Chelsea, on the sidewalk in front of Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon's house, and we were going in to have a breakfast meeting. We were waiting for a Jesuit who's working on this project with me, and I was kind of making small talk with Sister Helen. And I said to her, do you have problems with a lot of people contacting you now because of your high profile, trying to get you to help them with their, with their status on death row? And she got really, really mad at me, to the point where she was close to like hollering at me. And she said, how dare you assume that these men and these women that contact me have bad motives in trying to raise my attention to their issues of being on death row. And I was embarrassed because I thought of myself as a open-minded and sensitive person to the pro-life movement, especially in relationship to my work on the Dead Man Walking Theater project. But I was wrong, because I was approaching it from the point of view of those of us who have not killed people, and those of us who are not either innocent or guilty of committing crimes and are on death row. And for me, it was an incredible point of humility, because I recognized that, in fact, my pro-life position was taken from a position of elitism, of being involved in none of the things that get people caught up in death row, of never having been involved in a situation in which I or someone that I loved was considering or had an abortion. And so I was incredibly humbled. But what motivates me to talk about the Dead Man Walking Theater project is not only to talk about how little I understand the compassion that it takes to really be truly pro-life, but also to point out the fact that as a priest, as a Catholic, and as a Christian, I need to keep my heart open to all kinds of things that the rest of the world wants to be judgmental about. For I have been in the situation where somebody comes to me and tells me that they have had an abortion. I have had the situation of somebody coming to me to tell me that they're thinking of having an abortion, and know how helpless you can feel in the midst of a situation like that. But for me, the imperative is that if I am truly to be, as the church describes the priesthood, as in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, I must always keep my heart and my mind in a position of humility in the face of pro-life issues. For I must always be open to the person who comes to me to talk to me about seeking forgiveness for whatever it is that they ask to be forgiven for. In my pro-life journey, my exercise has been in remaining in a position in which I stand for and speak for life, while simultaneously holding in tension with that the idea that I must always be that open door, because reconciliation and the forgiveness of sin is at the center of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that is the reality that I represent in my given life choices.
My name is David Schindler, and I want to thank you all, first of all, for coming, so many of you for coming. It's on a beautiful day like this. I know you all want to be outside playing, so thank you for the effort. we were asked to talk about how the particular work that we do functions in relation to the pro-life cause or the culture of life generally. And I was reflecting on that because I teach philosophy, but I don't teach moral philosophy. And instead of moral philosophy, my areas really are more metaphysics and philosophical anthropology, these very sort of abstract things, which means that I focus on questions about the nature of reality and the nature of the human being. And you know, at first glance, it's not evident that there would be any direct connection to moral questions. And as a matter of fact, I rarely face those kinds of questions in a direct way in class or in my research or writing. But while that's the case in one sense, I think there's another way in which the kinds of things that I study do have a bearing. And as I reflected on it, I thought that philosophy and this kind of philosophy actually is, in a certain sense, in a kind of a privileged place, or at least has the potential of serving a kind of unique role in this whole question. So I think there are two ways in which that's the case, and I'll just mention those or describe those two ways. The first one is I think we're all aware that moral positions don't sort of come out of thin air. They don't just sort of float rootless. In fact, the kinds of moral positions that people hold are almost always, and I think arguably are always, in fact, in some sort of coherent relationship with other positions that they hold. So you don't sort of randomly, it's not like a cafeteria line where you hold this position on one issue and this on another. There tends to be a coherence, and that's not accidental. The reason it's not accidental is that our moral thinking, our moral reasoning, and our positions are always going to be the fruit of a fundamental view of the world. And I think we're all aware of that. It may be interesting to hear. I mean, when you find out certain things about people, you can almost always guess where they stand on certain moral questions. And it's because we have this intuitive sense that these issues are all connected. Now that worldview that is the foundation or the roots of their moral positions, that's not always something that's conscious. We don't always think, well, I think this way about the world and therefore I have these moral positions. I think most often it's unconscious, but it's there nonetheless. And so what does this mean? It means that in all of our moral reasoning, there's some basic judgments about the nature of reality and, as a consequence, the nature of the human being. Teaching metaphysics and philosophical anthropology, I mean, so one of the ways that there's kind of a unique role to play is that teaching about metaphysics and philosophical anthropology allows you to get to some of these root issues that are behind the moral position. So as I guess an example, all of my work, all of my teaching, and all of my writing focuses on what are called the classical transcendentals. Truth, beauty, and goodness. That's all I think about. That's all I want to think about. Truth, beauty, and goodness, and the sort of correlates in the human reality: reason, freedom, and love. Those are my topics, and I'm convinced, and it'd be interesting to sort of reflect on this if we had longer than 5 minutes or some other later opportunity. But I'm convinced that if a person understands reality as in its most fundamental, at its most fundamental core, good, true, and beautiful, that the culture of life just follows naturally from that. It just springs naturally from that. And so, you know, I try in my teaching to argue for this character of reality, and also just to bear witness to it. And I think one of the best ways to bear witness to the fact that reality is good, true, and beautiful is to be happy. Is simply to be joyful. If you're not joyful, it means you don't really believe that life is good, and you're not going to be very convincing if you say that to somebody. So that's one way. The second way, it seems to me that people, especially these days, are very turned off by sort of polarized thinking. You know, there are moral questions very quickly become what we call, you know, hot button issues, and typically when a hot button issue comes up, brains turn off, you know, and it tends to be emotion rather than reason, and people have difficulty speaking to one another. And so addressing these kinds of issues in a direct way is often a very frustrating task. Talking about metaphysics or philosophical anthropology, you're not hitting these things in a direct way. You're actually coming at them very indirectly, because you're kind of going behind them and getting at the roots, as I said earlier. So that means that people who might otherwise be very turned off by these kinds of discussions, through this more indirect approach, can actually be attracted to a different way of thinking about reality, in a very sort of subtle and maybe you know, slow, long-term sort of way. Be attracted to a different way of looking at the world, and then these other issues just would follow naturally. So in my experience in teaching here at Villanova, I've very often gotten to know students well and developed friendships, particularly with you know, atheistic students or you know, very cynical students otherwise. But we hit it off because they often like to talk metaphysics. And it becomes a way of looking at these things from more sort of grassroots sort of way. So anyway, those are I guess two particular ways that my work has some connection with all this. It's certainly not in the very impressive way of being a priest or directly addressing these questions, but I hope that's something.
Good luck. I think I'll be okay. Put it here. See if this will go this way. Yeah, I think there we go. The first thing I would like to do is to thank all of you for coming today. I deeply appreciate that. And I want to thank Chris Engelhardt, and Susanna for inviting me to this wonderful symposium this afternoon. My name is Amal Richie. I teach in the Department of History here at Villanova. I've been here since 1985. And actually, for me, all of this really begins in September of 1973, when I began my freshman year in my undergraduate studies, and I think I can mention this on this campus, at LaSalle College, now LaSalle University in Philadelphia. So one person is clapping, so we have some, so I think I'm okay. And why it begins for me in September of 1973 is because just 9 months earlier, 9 months before that, the United States Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by the late Justice Harry Blackmun, issued probably one of the most important decisions ever rendered by the United States Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade. And as a freshman at LaSalle, I was struggling with a lot of things, but I was struggling with the idea of how a court of supposedly very learned, erudite, legal people could come to such a conclusion that you could murder what I thought was human life. And for my first 2 years at LaSalle, we had no pro-life council, no pro-life club, no pro-life committee. It took until 1975 in my junior year when I actually got a group of individuals together at LaSalle and also at St. Joseph's University, and we actually formed the first intercollegiate pro-life undergraduate council in Philadelphia. And I do not believe that exists anymore, but at that time it did, and it actually developed into more than 1,000 students at one time. If you fast forward to 1985, when I joined the Villanova History Department, one of the things I always wanted to do was to talk about pro-life issues in my courses, but I would always be confronted with one thing. How am I going to work this into the curriculum? How am I possibly going to do this? Because going back many years ago, and those on the panel who have been here for a long time know that at one time we had a required course, actually courses here at Villanova, entitled Western Civilization. It was a requirement up until the year 1992. Every student at Villanova had to take 2 sections, fall and spring, of Western civilization. Every student except the engineering majors. The engineering majors are exempt from everything except math, physics, chemistry, and, and everything in the hard sciences. But I always thought about incorporating pro-life issues into these courses, and I did. I talked about pro-life issues when it came to the Roman Empire, talked about it during the Middle Ages, talked about it especially in modern history. Now, since 1994, we have had a required course entitled Themes in Modern World History, History 1050. Again, a requirement for everyone except the engineering students. And, and especially during the spring semester, I incorporate pro-life discussions about things such as the Holocaust. Because obviously, if you're not going to study the Holocaust, you're missing something which is very, very important in human history. And I also talk about the slaughter of people in current-day Darfur in Sudan, the genocide taking place there, the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, and also the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and how there were mass killings, genocide, crimes against humanity, even in Yugoslavia in Eastern Europe just 16, 17, 18 years ago. What I ask the students to do in all of this is to think about issues of life. It's this came out in the Nuremberg trials in 1945, 1946, when one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials, actually the father of the current senator from Connecticut, Christopher Dodd, his father was a lawyer and one of the American prosecutors. He always said, if I say 6 million people were murdered, that doesn't make an impact upon anyone. That's just a number. But if I can show them one individual, just one, who has been the victim of some heinous, horrible crime, then that will make an impact. And what I always say is, if you can see a fetus after an abortion, that makes an impact. You can talk about all the numbers of abortions which have occurred in this country, especially since Roe versus Wade in 1973. That number cannot compare to looking at one particular fetus, one, after an abortion. And I remember just several years ago when I was speaking with some individuals who were trying to convince me that pro-choice was something very, very legitimate. And I said, first of all, there's no such thing. And they said, what do you mean? I said, there's no such thing as pro-choice. Oh, sure there is. There's such a thing as pro-choice. I said, no, there is not. This goes back to something Dr. Steyr said, Bob Steyr said a little while ago, that your body is not your own. It also goes back to something Dr. Cesky said at the very beginning when he talked about the humanities. The root word in humanities, humane. Humane. It goes back to the Renaissance. It goes back to studying the humanities to become a more humane person, to be more human in everything we do. When somebody says pro-choice, there's no such thing. And I always say these individuals, very simply, do not look at that one fetus after an abortion. They take a very dogmatic view of it. They think that we have the dogmatic, authoritarian, hard-line, inflexible, rigid position. And that is not true. It is totally false. And as I listen to my good friends and colleagues, and I've learned a lot from what they have said thus far, as I listen very carefully to what they have said, it makes me even more convinced that as we go deeper into the 21st century, we have to be much more adamant in our pro-life positions. We have to be much more adamant about studying history and understanding these issues in history. You're doing great work here at Villanova, and that's something I hope you continue to do in taking all these different perspectives and all these different viewpoints from the symposium today. Thank you.
Is this okay down here? My name's Joseph Betts. I'm a philosophy teacher here.
I was moderator of Villanovans For Life from 1982 to 1992. I'm the only student activity moderator I ever heard of who was voted out of office. The organization was having a vote for the student officers. The student officers were very convinced Reaganites. They thought the way to be pro-life was to be a conservative Republican. Ronald Reagan, I had learned by paying attention to U.S. wars in Central America, El Salvador and Nicaragua, was a moral monster. He didn't know it. It could have been from stupidity, but he was a moral monster. I had always been in favor, very strongly in favor, of Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago. He was a Benedictine monk with a monastery before he became the cardinal, who taught the seamless garment approach to pro-life issues. That is, if you're going to be pro-life, it's not enough to be anti-abortion. You have to be anti-death penalty. You have to be anti-war. That's the way I tried to get the Villanovans For Life to think. It was an utter failure. They were convinced Reaganites. So I said, why don't you just de-elect me? And they did. I'm delighted that the current VFL has quite a different approach. This is the third event in a week that I've attended that VFL sponsored. There's the vigil for Virginia Lewis put to death last Wednesday night. There was the exonerated death row inmate 2 nights ago, and then there's this. So the current VFL leadership, thank goodness, has seen the light. I don't know why during my time they didn't. They were champions of people like Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms was known for his anti-abortion stance. There was a national pro-life banquet to which Jesse Helms invited the probable murderer, his name was D'Aubusson, a Salvadoran, of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador. The UN commission looking into the murders of the Jesuits and others blamed Major D'Aubusson, and he was a good friend of Jesse Helms, which means the famous pro-life senator didn't know what pro-life meant. I teach the philosophy of criminal justice, and I oppose the death penalty in it. Same thing in the philosophy of law. I teach a regular course in the ethics of war, and I'm 99% opposed to wars. America's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are immoral. If you look in just war theory, they do not at all fit the model. The ethics of war course that I will be teaching next semester has not only a section on El Salvador, but a section on the cruel British bombing program in World War II, which aimed at the built-up civilian sections of all the German cities. They were convinced they had to destroy as much of the German civilian population as possible. A very strong violation of a pro-life ethic and the rules of war. You are not allowed to deliberately target civilians, and we learned from them that we would do the same thing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Very immoral actions. The idea that, well, Ronald Reagan's way of being pro-life was to hold that the right to life ends at birth. He destroyed many programs for the poor, many programs that would have allowed poor mothers, welfare for instance, to continue in their poverty to hold their children. I became convinced that the only way to treat women in such a way that the poor will keep their children is to adopt democratic socialism. You might have heard of Michael Harrington. He's the author of The Other America. The Other America was the book that convinced the Kennedy administration to begin the war on poverty. Kennedy died before it got into gear, but Johnson did a good job with that war on poverty. Michael Harrington did that and was also the president of the Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America, and any, any decent socialist, holds that you need universal single payment health care, you need education as much as the kid could get, you need decent housing, you need decent food, you need to guarantee jobs. None of them are things that modern conservatives, who are reputed to be pro-life, do anything about. The last thing I'll tell you is that I just taught a case in the philosophy of law today, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992. This was generated, by the way, by a Villanova graduate. For many years in the state legislature, the 1966 president of his class at Villanova, Steve Friend from Havertown, was the representative in the Havertown district in Congress. He was very pro-life. He was very effective pro-life in Congress. He generated anti-Roe versus Wade stances that Planned Parenthood fought, and they won in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. The reason I'm mentioning this case is this. There were 3 conservative appointments among the 5 justices that voted to reaffirm Roe versus Wade. They were O'Connor, Souter, and Kennedy. Before this vote, before this case in the Supreme Court, they had all said that they believed that the Roe versus Wade reasoning was wrong, that it was wrong to simply say that the fetus is potential life. The fetus is actual life. The fetus isn't potential human life, it's actual human life. But they claim that because of the doctrine of precedent, that is, because law will be unstable if it changes too often, because women have come to rely since 1973 on Roe versus Wade, in spite of their better convictions, they felt bound by the doctrine of precedent to vote to establish Roe versus Wade. The reason I mention that is conservatives think that the way to end abortion is to appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court. Here's 3 of them so appointed. They failed the conservative way entirely. At any rate, thank you, and VFL, keep having the kind of events you've been having. I'm proud of you. I wasn't proud of the group that I ended up with.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists.